Okay, we're going to be talking about ecosystem productivity today. So this covers the following IB applications and skills: analyzing quantitative models of flows of energy of matter, analyzing the efficiency of energy transfers through a system, calculating the values of both GPP and NPP from given data, as well as the values of GSP and NSP from given data. So we're going to cover these specific definitions a little bit later, but for now you can just write down these terms with some space to add more. We have gross productivity, which is represented by GP, net productivity, primary productivity, and secondary productivity. And potentially, hopefully, you should be able to figure out what GSP, NPP, GPP, and NSP mean from this information. So productivity is going to always start with basically producers who take energy from the sun or from other sources and turn it into energy that can be used by other organisms. So these are autotrophs, which make their own food. Most of them use the sun, photoautotrophs, though some down in the deep sea vents might use other sources, the chemoautotrophs. And they convert that inorganic carbon into organic carbon, which most importantly can be used by other living organisms. Some people might claim that they are sun gazers, but we are all actually heterotrophs. We need to get our energy from other organisms. And so producers do this through a process called photosynthesis, or most of them use photosynthesis. And in biology, you have to know lots of details about photosynthesis. In ESS, we're mostly worried about the inputs and then the outputs of photosynthesis, which you can remember in two equations. So take a second, see if you can recall those equations on your own, pause the video, and then hit play when you're ready to see them. Here they are. Oh, hopefully you got it right. The IB will accept either the chemical equation or the English words for them as well. So don't feel like you have to remember C6H12O6. You could just say sugars or glucose. Okay, so for some definitions, gross productivity is going to be the total biomass produced or the overall rate of energy capture. That word gross refers to the total overall rate of something. Whereas net productivity is going to refer to the total biomass produced after there's biomass used by the organism in respiration. So this is really the key of net productivity, is you're subtracting those values first. And then primary productivity is just going to measure productivity at the first trophic level in producers, where secondary productivity will measure all other trophic levels and consumers. This one gets a little bit tricky because we also have primary consumers, which would be measured with secondary productivity. So just be very careful there. Secondary productivity refers to all consumers, not just secondary consumers. And primary productivity is only for primary producers, which makes sense. And then you can use this information to determine what GPP, NPP, etc. means. So gross primary productivity versus gross secondary productivity, or net primary versus net secondary. So this is a distribution of productivity throughout the world. And you can kind of notice some really obvious trends, right? We see this patch along the equator, like we've seen with our biome study, lots of rainforests and stuff there, and then the deserts here with a lot less productivity. So this variation, we see the equatorial areas with that high insolation, really high productivity. And then also shallow waters near the continents tend to have more productivity as well. And also areas of upwelling. And then those deserts and arid regions have a lot of limiting factors like the amount of water or extreme temperatures. So there's fewer plants. And the same with oceans, not a lot of nutrients out in the open ocean and only sunlight at the surface. So upwelling is one of the big factors here. This happens generally along coastal regions where the wind blows the surface water away to create kind of an open space so that deep water moves up to take the space of the surface water. And that deep water has a lot more nutrients that you don't find on the surface since they get used up on the surface. So that influx of nutrients really helps generate growth just like when you add fertilizer to your garden and it generates growth. So you can see the comparison of area versus productivity here, with the open ocean consisting of like 81% of the area, yet consisting of just a tiny little fraction of the productivity. And then areas of upwelling less than 1%, yet accounting for just about half of the total productivity in the oceans. Pretty astounding areas. So we have some graphs of chlorophyll here, showing ocean levels. We have the coast on the left side of the graph here, and then further from the coast moving to the left, and then ocean depths as well with the surface of the ocean here, and then going down deeper. This is off the coast of California, I believe, and we see seasonal progression moving from the spring and summer into the fall and winter months. So the first question is, why do you think they're measuring chlorophyll here? What is that representing? I'll let you think to yourself. Hopefully you've thought chlorophyll, photosynthesis uses chlorophyll. Oh, maybe this is showing productivity. So then that brings us to upwelling, right? So this is an area where there's lots of upwelling, bringing all those nutrients to the surface. And so you see lots of productivity in those times of upwelling with the extra nutrients. So there's extra photosynthesis, extra chlorophyll, and way more productivity, more biomass being generated, versus the winter months, less upwelling, and so less productivity overall. My question is that if there's more nutrients down there before the upwelling, how come there's not more productivity down below as well? You would think that if there's nutrients, then maybe there'd be stuff growing down there using the nutrients. So consider, why do you think there might be less productivity down there? Perhaps you're thinking it's because there's not enough sunlight. That's the key factor, right? Insolation. Which is why you don't see much productivity in most of the open ocean. Most of it's really far away from the sun. Oops. Okay, so we can compare productivity in lots of different ecosystems here. So first, I want you just to identify the top 3 and the bottom 3 ecosystems in terms of average annual net productivity here. And then when you find those, compare them to the percentage of global net primary productivity. So this is sort of on their own, what's their productivity like? And then what is their productivity as a percent of the global total? And you might notice some interesting trends here. You can pause, think for yourself, and then unpause. And so I noticed this really interesting trend, right? We see rainforests have really high productivity, which we know, and then also have a high percentage of the world's productivity. Makes sense. Same down here, we have deserts and extreme deserts with low productivity and a low percentage of the overall productivity. However, we have algal beds and swamps and marshes, which are really, really, really productive, even more productive algal beds are than rainforests. However, a global percentage is much, 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 much smaller, which is rather strange. And on the other side, we have oceans, open oceans, which are really low average productivity. However, as a global total, you'll notice the oceans are a little bit taller. Well, quite a bit taller, actually. So think to yourself, why do you think that is? Perhaps you look at this middle graph, which shows the percentage of global surface area, and you notice, oh, look, the rainforest, pretty tall. These other ones, pretty tall. The oceans, they're looking funny. Oh, they're so tall, they don't even fit on the graph. So the reason they have such a large portion of the total productivity isn't that they're just productive on their own. It's just that they take up so much space. Makes sense. So some of that GPP is used to stay alive, to grow, to reproduce, to do all these types of things. NPP, net primary productivity, is going to be what's left over. And the areas with the most NPP are places that I love personally: estuaries and swamps, tropical rainforests. The lower NPP, as we just saw, open oceans, tundras, deserts. And then, as we just saw, the open ocean with the low NPP, but a large area, gives it a larger overall percentage. So this first part, some GPP is used to stay alive, grow, and reproduce. Our fancy word for that is respiration. So we could think about that. Some GPP is used as respiration, And then NPP, net primary productivity, is what's left over. So see if you can use these three variables to determine an equation to find the value of NPP. And your equation hopefully looks something like this. Net primary productivity is equal to gross primary productivity minus respiration. As we remember, net productivity is the productivity after losses, and these are our losses, right? That 10% rule from the second law of thermodynamics way back last year, where we learned that we're always losing energy. This is the energy being lost, and that's why NPP is going to be lower than GPP. In consumers, we do a little bit different calculations here. So we on a plant, to calculate gross productivity, it's all the sunlight that's being used in photosynthesis, right? Some of that energy gets used in respiration by the plant. So that's how we calculate NPP. Consumers, they're not using sunlight, right? They're consuming food. So to calculate their gross productivity, we need to just look at the food that they intake and then subtract fecal losses, because actually all the stuff you pass through your food, through your fecal system, doesn't actually get absorbed into your body. That's all processed later. Yeah, so you can actually do those calculations in really controlled settings if you wanted to. We probably won't go past this in class, but I'm just going to carry on for this video. Some details about measuring. So ideally, you'd want to control this in a lab, so you can really control the food intake by an organism. And then measuring the waste of the organism as well to get your totals, where the gross secondary productivity is equal to the intake minus the waste. For net secondary productivity, you're just basically looking at how much the organism has grown, right? That's our ultimate goal in taking food, is either to use the energy in respiration and other processes, or to grow larger. So net productivity, if it's not including respiration, would just be that change in biomass. So you start with their starting mass, and then you subtract it from the ending mass to get the total. Some evaluations of these methods. So secondary productivity is really, really difficult to measure in natural conditions because there's so many variables. Like, it's hard to tell exactly what these animals are eating out in the wild, and then to collect all of their excrement. And even in the lab, it can be really difficult. You have to actually dry out all the waste samples to make it pretty accurate. And then for secondary productivity, it can be hard to measure on shorter time scales. If anyone has tracked their own personal weight, you might notice that there's kind of a lot of fluctuation even throughout the day. You know, you might be a couple pounds heavier or lighter even at different points of the day, based on, you know, your food intake, your hydration levels, other stuff. So more useful over a long period of time, but this stuff is all pretty hard to get super accurate measurements of. And then we can look at things that affect levels of productivity. So temperature, of course, as we saw with deserts with the extreme temperatures, the amount of water is another huge one. Insolation and light exposure. You actually can have like different levels of, or different types of plants at high elevation, because there's more ultraviolet light, which can affect their growth. Lots of different differences. Salinity levels will affect the growth of different organisms. In the Southwest here, we see ocotillo, which only grow in really acidic soils. We're going to probably look at this in class on Thursday, Friday, but we're going to consider how you might come up with some experiments to measure differences in these productivities.